Most people picture a narcissist as someone loud, dominating the conversation, bragging without shame, impossible to miss in a room. A covert narcissist sounds nothing like that, and that's exactly why they're so much harder to identify and so much more disorienting to deal with once you're close to one. They can sit across from you soft-spoken, self-deprecating, seemingly humble, and leave you feeling slightly off in a way you can't quite explain. And if you don't know what to listen for, that feeling will pass unexamined every single time. Today, we're going to walk through 5 specific listenable clues that reveal a covert narcissist in ordinary conversation. Not personality traits you'd need years to notice, but actual verbal patterns you can start recognizing within a single conversation, sometimes within a single exchange, once you know exactly what to listen for. The first clue: every story eventually redirects back to their suffering, no matter where it started. This is worth understanding carefully because it's easy to mistake for something else entirely: genuine vulnerability, or simply someone processing their own difficult experiences openly, which isn't inherently a red flag on its own. The distinguishing feature isn't that they talk about their own pain, it's the redirection itself, the specific, repeated pattern of a conversation starting somewhere else entirely, often about you, your experience, your day, your struggle, and ending up through a series of small conversational pivots back on them. Listen for this in practice. You mentioned you've had a hard week at work. A covert narcissist doesn't typically respond with simple, direct curiosity about what happened to you. Instead, you'll often hear something like, "That sounds exhausting. I know exactly what you mean. My job has been absolutely draining me lately. Nobody there appreciates what I actually do." Notice what happened in that exchange. Your hard week became, within 2 sentences, a doorway into their own grievance, delivered with just enough acknowledgement of your experience to seem responsive, while actually using your opening as the entry point for their own extended narrative. This pattern is worth listening for specifically because of its consistency across completely unrelated topics. It doesn't matter what you bring up: a health scare, a family conflict, a professional disappointment, even genuine excitement about something good happening in your life. The redirection mechanism activates regardless of the subject matter because its function isn't actually about the specific content of what you said. It's about restoring the conversation to its preferred center of gravity, which is always eventually them. Once you start listening for this specifically, you'll notice it's remarkably mechanical once you know the shape to look for. Bam, a brief acknowledgement, a pivot word like "actually" or "same" or "I get that because," followed by an extended return to their own experience that often ends up dwarfing whatever you originally shared. The second clue: compliments toward you arrive with a built-in diminishment. This is one of the more subtle patterns because on the surface, it sounds like praise, and most people don't examine praise closely enough to notice the structure underneath it. Listen for compliments that contain a quiet qualifier, a comparison, or a backhanded element that softens or undercuts the positive statement, often so smoothly that the undercut barely registers consciously, even though something about the exchange leaves you feeling slightly deflated rather than genuinely appreciated. This sounds like, "You're actually really smart for someone who didn't go to graduate school," or "I'm impressed you pulled that off. I honestly didn't think you had it in you," or, more subtly still, "You look really good today. You should dress like this more often." Each of these examples contains a genuine compliment on the surface, paired with an embedded diminishment that either questions your baseline competence, implies surprise at a positive outcome that shouldn't have been surprising, or suggests your usual presentation falls short of the standard being praised in this specific instance. Here's why this pattern matters so much to listen for specifically. It serves a very particular function in the relationship: keeping you in a subtle, ongoing state of seeking validation without ever fully receiving it. A genuine compliment received cleanly tends to settle. You feel good about the specific thing being acknowledged, and the moment passes without needing anything further. A backhanded compliment doesn't settle the same way. Some part of you notices the qualifier, even if you can't immediately articulate why the compliment felt slightly off. And that unsettled feeling creates a subtle hunger for a cleaner version of approval next time, keeping you oriented toward earning validation you haven't quite yet fully received. The third clue: disagreement gets met with an immediate shift toward their own hurt feelings rather than engagement with the actual content of the disagreement. This is worth listening for specifically in moments of genuine, even mild disagreement because it reveals something important about how a covert narcissist processes any perceived challenge to their perspective. In a healthy conversation, disagreement typically produces some combination of clarification, explanation, or genuine consideration of the other person's point, an actual engagement with the substance of what's being disputed. Listen instead for a pattern where disagreement produces an almost immediate pivot toward the covert narcissist's emotional response to being disagreed with, rather than any engagement with the actual disagreement itself. This sounds like responding to, "I don't think that's quite what happened," with, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking me right now," or, "I feel like nothing I say is ever good enough for you." Responses that convert a simple factual or perspective-based disagreement into an emotional crisis, requiring your comfort and reassurance, rather than an actual conversation about the substance of what you originally disagreed about. Notice that the original topic of disagreement essentially disappears in this pattern, replaced entirely by a new, more urgent conversation about managing their hurt feelings. This clue is worth listening for specifically because of how effectively it shuts down any genuine exchange of differing perspectives. If every disagreement gets converted into an emotional crisis requiring your comfort, you learn quickly and often unconsciously to simply stop disagreeing at all, because the cost of doing so, having to manage an escalated emotional reaction that has nothing to do with the actual substance of the disagreement, consistently outweighs whatever benefit might come from voicing a differing perspective in the first place. The fourth clue, they narrate their own kindness in real time rather than simply being kind. This is a specific and fairly reliable clue, worth listening for because it reveals something important about the function generosity actually serves in these interactions. Genuine kindness, offered without needing acknowledgement, doesn't typically require narration. It simply happens, often without much comment at all, because the value of the act exists independently of whether anyone notices or mentions it. Listen instead for kindness that comes paired with its own built-in commentary, drawing attention to the act while it's happening, almost as if ensuring the generosity doesn't go unnoticed or uncredited. This sounds like, "I'm being so patient with you right now," delivered in the middle of an actual moment of patience, or, "Most people wouldn't even bother helping with something like this, but I always show up," said while actually providing help, or, "I really didn't have to do this for you," attached to an act that's ostensibly meant to be a simple gesture of care. Each of these statements converts an act of kindness into a transaction requiring acknowledgement, turning what should be a simple, unremarked gesture into something that demands recognition and gratitude in order to feel complete on their end. The fifth clue, apologies contain conditional language rather than direct acknowledgement. This final clue is worth listening for with real precision because the difference between a genuine apology and a conditional one often comes down to a single word or phrase, easy to miss if you're not specifically attuned to it. Listen for apologies that include words like if, but, or phrases like "you felt," rather than direct acknowledgement of what actually happened. "I'm sorry if that upset you" is fundamentally different from "I'm sorry I said that, it was wrong." The first version makes your reaction the variable in question, implying the apology is only warranted if you happen to feel upset rather than acknowledging that the behavior itself was the actual problem, regardless of how you responded to it. The common thread running through all 5 clues isn't arrogance in its obvious form. It's something considerably more sophisticated. Every conversational pattern we've discussed quietly accomplishes the same objective: preserving an internal sense of specialness without ever needing to state it outright. That's what makes covert narcissism so difficult to detect. The manipulation doesn't happen through domination. It happens through implication, through carefully constructed conversations that leave you subtly adjusting yourself while the other person remains comfortably at the emotional center of the interaction. There's another pattern that deserves close attention, because it's often the point where people finally realize something isn't quite right. Watch how he responds when someone disagrees with him, not during a heated argument. Those situations can bring out defensiveness in almost anyone. Instead, pay attention to ordinary differences of opinion. Perhaps you interpret a film differently. Perhaps you disagree about a political issue, a parenting decision, or even something as insignificant as where to eat dinner. Healthy disagreement usually produces curiosity. Emotionally secure people ask questions. They explore your perspective even when they don't ultimately share it. The covert narcissist often does something much subtler. Rather than directly telling you you're wrong, he quietly reframes your opinion as evidence that you've misunderstood something deeper. I used to think that too until I understood what was really going on. I can see why you'd think that if you haven't experienced what I have. On the surface, these statements sound respectful. Underneath them sits an entirely different message. Your perspective isn't genuinely equal to mine because your understanding isn't as developed. Notice what happens psychologically. Instead of debating ideas, you suddenly feel compelled to defend your intelligence. The conversation quietly shifts from discussing the topic to proving your competence. That's rarely an accident. Another revealing behavior appears in the questions he asks. Most people assume asking questions automatically demonstrates interest, but the purpose behind the question matters just as much as the question itself. Healthy curiosity expands your understanding of another person. Covert narcissistic curiosity often functions differently. Questions become information-gathering tools. He asks about previous relationships, your family, your childhood, your insecurities, your ambitions, not necessarily because he feels deeply interested in understanding you, but because every answer provides useful information about how you see yourself, what you value, and where your emotional vulnerabilities might exist. At first, this level of attention feels refreshing. You think, finally, someone who genuinely wants to know me. But over time, something interesting happens. The information flows almost entirely in one direction. You know remarkably little about him despite having countless conversations. Whenever discussion begins moving too close to something genuinely vulnerable in his own life, the topic somehow changes. Perhaps he makes a joke. Perhaps he asks another question. Perhaps he redirects attention toward your experiences again. The result is an unusual imbalance. He understands your emotional landscape far better than you understand his. That imbalance quietly creates influence. Because the person who knows more about your fears, hopes, and emotional triggers often holds considerably more power inside the relationship. There's another conversational habit people frequently overlook because it sounds remarkably compassionate. He validates your feelings right before gently replacing them with his interpretation. Imagine saying, "That conversation really upset me." He responds, "I know why you feel that way. You're probably reacting because you've been hurt before." Again, this sounds insightful. Perhaps it even feels comforting. Until you notice something important. He isn't asking whether his interpretation is accurate. He's telling you what your own internal experience supposedly means. Healthy people remain curious about your emotional world. They ask, "Is that how you experienced it?" They don't automatically assume they understand your thoughts better than you do. Covert narcissistic communication often carries this quiet certainty that other people's emotions require his explanation. Over time, this creates a subtle but significant shift. You begin looking to him to explain your own feelings. You stop trusting your first instinct. You start wondering whether your emotional reactions are valid unless he agrees with them. And that's exactly how confidence begins eroding. Not through dramatic criticism, through repeated small moments where your own perspective becomes secondary to someone else's interpretation of your reality. Perhaps the most revealing clue of all isn't found in any single sentence. It's found in how you consistently feel after the conversation ends. Think back to the healthiest conversations you've ever had. You probably felt lighter, more understood, more comfortable being yourself. Even difficult discussions often left you feeling respected because genuine connection creates emotional safety. Now compare that with conversations involving someone displaying these covert patterns. You leave mentally replaying everything you said. You wonder whether you shared too much. You question whether you accidentally offended them. You feel strangely responsible for their mood. Most confusing of all, you struggle to explain exactly what happened because nothing sounded obviously manipulative. That lingering confusion is worth paying attention to. Your nervous system often notices unhealthy dynamics long before your conscious mind can organize them into words. This doesn't mean every uncomfortable conversation signals covert narcissism. Human beings have misunderstandings. Everyone has moments of insecurity, defensiveness, and poor communication. The difference is consistency. Healthy people occasionally make these mistakes. Covert narcissistic patterns quietly repeat themselves across conversations, across relationships, and across entirely different areas of life. Once you begin recognizing that consistency, you stop focusing only on individual comments. You begin seeing the architecture underneath them. And when you finally recognize that architecture, something changes forever. Because the next conversation no longer feels confusing, you begin recognizing the pattern while it's happening, not after you've already started questioning yourself. Recognizing the pattern while it's happening is where genuine psychological freedom begins. Not because you've suddenly become immune to manipulation, but because awareness changes the conversation before the conversation has a chance to change you. Once you understand what you're listening for, you stop evaluating people solely by how polite they sound. You begin paying closer attention to how consistently their words and emotional patterns align. And that single shift can completely transform the way you experience relationships. One of the greatest misconceptions about covert narcissism is that it can be identified through a checklist after one conversation. Human personality simply doesn't work that way. Every emotionally immature person occasionally seeks reassurance. Every insecure person sometimes talks too much about themselves. Every individual has moments where they become defensive, misunderstand someone else, or unintentionally redirect a conversation. None of those behaviors, in isolation, define narcissism. What matters is repetition. What matters is whether these conversational patterns consistently move in one direction, toward preserving their self-image, toward maintaining emotional control, toward quietly positioning themselves as the person whose feelings, interpretations, and experiences ultimately carry more weight than everyone else's. That consistency is what separates an occasional communication flaw from a deeply rooted interpersonal pattern. There's another reason covert narcissism remains hidden for so long. Most people are taught to pay attention to words. Very few people are taught to pay attention to emotional outcomes. Imagine leaving two different conversations. In the first, very little agreement takes place. You disagree on several topics. You challenge each other's ideas. Yet somehow you leave feeling respected, heard, and comfortable. You don't feel smaller because someone saw the world differently than you. Now imagine a second conversation. Everything appears pleasant. Nobody raises their voice. Nobody openly criticizes you. Yet afterwards, you're strangely exhausted. You're replaying the discussion. You're wondering if you said too much. You're questioning decisions that felt perfectly reasonable before the conversation began. Nothing obvious happened, yet something clearly changed. That's often the difference between healthy disagreement and subtle emotional manipulation. Healthy communication may challenge your opinions. Manipulative communication quietly challenges your trust in yourself. And that distinction is one of the most valuable psychological skills anyone can develop. It's also worth remembering that covert narcissists rarely begin relationships using these patterns intensely. If they did, very few people would stay. Instead, the behaviors usually appear gradually. At first, the conversations feel unusually deep. You feel understood, you feel noticed, you appreciate how attentive they seem. Only later do you begin noticing that the attention gradually becomes influence. The empathy slowly becomes evaluation. The curiosity becomes subtle analysis. The support becomes quiet correction. By the time these changes become obvious, you've often formed an emotional bond that makes the patterns much harder to question objectively. That's why so many intelligent, emotionally aware people miss the signs. Not because they're naive, because manipulation delivered through warmth is considerably more difficult to recognize than manipulation delivered through hostility. Perhaps the most important question isn't, how do I expose a covert narcissist? A healthier question is, how do I protect my own emotional clarity? The answer begins with trusting your internal experience. If you consistently leave conversations feeling confused, diminished, or responsible for another person's emotions, don't ignore those feelings simply because the words sounded kind. Curiosity matters. Respect matters. Emotional safety matters. Healthy communication should expand your confidence, not gradually reduce it. Another useful habit is allowing yourself time before explaining, apologizing, or defending your perspective. Covert manipulation often relies on immediate emotional reactions. The moment you pause, the moment you give yourself permission to think, the moment you ask yourself, is this actually my responsibility? You interrupt the pattern. That pause creates space for discernment instead of guilt, and discernment is one of the strongest forms of emotional protection you can develop. It's equally important to surround yourself with people whose conversations leave you feeling more like yourself, not less. Emotionally healthy people don't require you to constantly prove your intelligence. They don't quietly compete with your happiness. They don't make every discussion revolve around their hidden need for validation. Instead, they celebrate your successes without diminishing them. They respect your boundaries without making you feel guilty. They allow disagreements without treating them as personal threats. Most importantly, they leave you feeling lighter after you've spent time together. If there's one lesson to take away from today's discussion, let it be this. Don't judge people only by how convincing they sound. Judge them by the emotional pattern they consistently create around you. Do you feel safe expressing different opinions? Do you feel genuinely heard? Do you leave conversations feeling respected rather than second-guessing yourself? Those answers often reveal far more than the words themselves ever could, because the most revealing clue about a covert narcissist isn't found in a single clever sentence. It's found in the quiet transformation that happens inside the people who spend years talking to them. And once you learn to recognize those conversational patterns, you stop giving hidden manipulation the one thing it depends on most: your unnoticed attention. From that moment forward, conversations become something entirely different, not a place where you slowly lose confidence, but a place where your awareness quietly protects it.